All right, let's get started. This is lecture 23. We're going to transition to the next topic, historical legacies of slavery and colonialism. For the next couple lectures, and then we're going to talk about a number of other issues. The last few lectures, part of the reason for getting into historical legacies is just to understand how sub-Saharan African countries started out where they started out during the period we've been mainly studying in this course, which is the last 40 or 50 years. In terms of assignments, problem set 3 is the last assignment before the final, and it's due on Tuesday. So in 5 days, and I posted it a couple days ago. Any questions before I get started? This sounds particularly loud to me today. Maybe let me try to turn it down a little bit. Is that better? Or maybe it's the same? I'll whisper. Okay, so long-run impacts of slavery is actually what we're going to focus on today. And there's the Nathan Nunn chapter on your reading list, and then on Tuesday we're going to discuss continuities in economic policy from the colonial period into the post-colonial period. The Nunn piece is really, I think, pretty interesting. It's based on an academic article, but really has a lot of the results from the original article. Nunn has a series of papers on the long-run impact of slavery on African development, and this chapter summarizes some of them. So, if we're going to talk about slavery, we have to go back a while, about 500-600 years to get to the starting point. The interest in slavery, I think, is pretty obvious. I think a lot of people understand that the slave trade, which so affected the development of New World countries, could also potentially affect Africa in profound ways. And historians have hypothesized about this, demographers, anthropologists, and now economists are starting to collect some bigger data sets, mainly Nathan Nunn and some others, trying to make sense of what the historical legacies of slavery were. But to get a sense of why it might matter, I think getting it at the magnitudes, the numbers, is very important. So let's just go through some of the numbers and some of the history. The basic starting point is there were about 400 years over which many millions of Africans were forcibly and brutally enslaved, and most were taken very far away from sub-Saharan Africa, many to the New World, many to what is today the US, many of the victims of capture and enslavement were taken to the Caribbean, to South America, etc. So that was one slave trade we'll talk about. And then there was a whole other set of slave trades where slave traders were attacking and preying on Africans and then sending them to the Middle East as slaves, sending them to South Asia. There are millions of people in what is today India and Pakistan who are partially of African descent, and there's more and more recognition of that as well. So this was really a global phenomenon. It was a major historical event that touched many, if not most, parts of the world. It started in the 15th century in what is today Congo, sort of the mouth of the Congo River, Democratic Republic of Congo and Republic of Congo. Today, and the first European slave traders, well, this is really the beginning of the European slave trade. There were earlier Middle Eastern and Indian Ocean slave trades even before this time. But these were the first European slave traders, and the first sort of organized effort to capture Africans and enslave them was carried out by the Portuguese in this area, basically the mouth of the Congo River, in what is today sort of northern Angola, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Congo. So in that area, there was a very well-developed, pretty large kingdom called the Congo Kingdom. It was that kingdom that gave the river its name and gave the region its name. Yeah, Radhika. We're going to go. Let's go there. So there's going to be a slide that says why Africa in like 5 slides. It's a great question, and maybe everybody can think about that because it's something I want us to think about and talk about. But it's a very important question for understanding what's going on. So the Congo Kingdom starts getting basically attacked. So in this early stage of slave trade, Portuguese themselves would go on shore with weapons and teams of marauders and capture people and take them to ships. That was actually how it worked. Now, very soon after that, the trade became much more organized internally within sub-Saharan Africa, and almost all of the slave trading was being done by Africans capturing other Africans and just taking them to well-known sort of slave trading ports on the coast where the Europeans would purchase these people who were forcibly enslaved and brutally enslaved. In the early days, the Portuguese themselves were marauding. And the Congo Kingdom is an interesting case. There had been this contacts for a while through trade between the Portuguese and some of the Congo leaders. There was even a king, King Afonso of the Congo, who had converted to Christianity, had learned to speak and write Portuguese, who wrote letters, these terrible, poignant letters to European leaders, to the Pope, basically calling on them to get them to stop the Portuguese from raiding his kingdom. And using the language sort of the Portuguese themselves, saying, look, as a fellow Christian, why are you guys doing this to us? We're not your enemies. And his own family, members of the royal family, had been enslaved. The goal of this slave raiding and trading by the Portuguese was to get a captive workforce for new Portuguese plantations, mainly sugar plantations, on the Atlantic islands of Sao Tome and then also Cape Verde, which were sort of new Portuguese colonies where they had set up lucrative sugar plantations. Of course, once Europeans started colonizing the Americas, there was sort of a massive expansion of that plantation agriculture, and the demand among Portuguese, Spanish, French, English imperialists for a captive workforce grew dramatically. So, as disruptive and terrible as the slave trading was in the Congo Kingdom, it became just infinitely worse. And we'll show you some of the numbers. That there was just a sort of trickle of people being captured as slaves at this point, and it got much worse. And as it grows and becomes this multi-million person trade, the question that Nathan Nunn poses, and the question that's been on a lot of people's minds for a long time, is how did this trade affect development in Africa? Once you think about it for more than 5 minutes, you can imagine many different ways that this kind of activity could disrupt institutions, culture, governments, the economy, etc. And we'll talk about some of those. And the claim that's made in Nathan Nunn's papers is that he basically has put together the best possible data to answer this. So what I want to do to start, just so we can open up and to get people's sense of what's going on, is start with a clicker question, which is this one. If we are going to think through the different channels through which these slave trades I told you about, the Atlantic slave trade, the Middle Eastern and Asian slave trades, as we think about what effect they have on African development, what are some of the channels you think are most plausible? One is, was it through reducing population? Basically, if millions of Africans were taken out of Africa, could that have hindered African development? That's A. B, did African societies become more violent once a lot of slave raiding and slave trading started? C, did the existence of the slave trade, which victimized Africans and sent them around the world as slaves, hinder African development by creating very racist, negative portrayals or views about Africans? These individuals have been brutalized through the slave trade. Could the exposure to the slave trade have affected the ethnic composition of African societies? And then finally, maybe you're not entirely convinced that there was a negative effect. Maybe this is something that was just sort of going on but didn't affect Africa's long-run trajectory. Okay. So a lot of people put C, increased racism, B, African societies became more violent. Some people put A and D, population, ethnic composition. So clearly there's a lot of different things that seem plausible to different people. And actually there's even more explanations than this. So we'll kind of go through, we'll go through a bunch of them, but a bunch of these actually come through in the data. So what is the magnitude? As I mentioned, there were these 3 different slave trades. Some people call them 4. Some cases they distinguish between the trans-Saharan slave trade and the Red Sea trade, although they're kind of related geographically. There was a separate slave trade, the Indian Ocean trade, where Africans were captured and sent to South Asia or parts of the Persian Gulf, Kuwait, Oman. Well, Oman is sort of bordering the Gulf. But the largest of all the trades was the Atlantic Ocean trade, which was, again, the enslavement of Africans to be sent to the Americas. These are just crazy numbers, huge numbers of people. Just to give you a sense of the numbers, the best estimate that demographers have, and historians have, and they're not perfect, but their best estimates were that the population of sub-Saharan Africa in the 1400s was about 50 million people. So we're saying that over the next few hundred years, tens of millions of people were captured as slaves. Very large numbers. And there were a couple of key points. The key sort of trading point and launch point for the Indian Ocean trade was Zanzibar, which is this island right here off the coast of Tanzania. It's part of Tanzania today. It was a major slave trading center. It was also a major spice trading center. If you go to Zanzibar, you can see the slave market. It was operating until fairly recently. It was operating until about 100 years ago, a little bit more than 100 years ago. The Red Sea trade was operating in this part of sub-Saharan Africa, basically capture of slaves from East Africa to be sent to Yemen, Saudi, and other parts of the Middle East. The trans-Saharan trade was operating here from Nigeria, Senegal, et cetera, north, and then the Atlantic trade really operated in a very wide region, even in some ways around to Mozambique. This whole region was sort of victimized by the Atlantic trade. In fact, it's not a coincidence that sort of there were Portuguese colonies sort of all around here. A lot of their early trade was related to slavery. Yeah. 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 So this doesn't even account for all those who died. No one knows how many died. There's so many points along which people died during the slave trade. It's very hard to estimate. So if we go back to the map, if I was an individual captured in northern Nigeria and then was to be enslaved and sent to North Africa across the Sahara, I might have been captured near my village and resisted capture and been killed. And those numbers aren't recorded anywhere. So these are the number of people who basically get on ships to be taken somewhere where there's sort of records about them. Now, some of those individuals died of the 20 million, but that doesn't mean 20 million is the upper bound. There's just millions more who died along the way, evading capture, et cetera. So these are almost certainly lower down numbers on numbers. And to get a sense of how the trade changed over time, as I mentioned in the early days, there were still thousands of people being taken per year and enslaved. So over the course of a century, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. But the numbers increased dramatically. So in the 1600s, the numbers increased a lot. And in the 1700s were the period with the largest volumes of the slave trade, where in any given year there were 50,000 to 100,000 individuals being captured in any given year in the slave trade. And then the numbers drop off in the 1800s, but the numbers in the 1800s are actually less reliable than the numbers in the 1700s. And usually it goes the other way. Over time, data gets better. What ends up happening is in 1808, in 1808, the British Empire outlawed slavery. And they started a policy of when they did find slave ships on the Atlantic Ocean, bringing those ships and the human beings who had been enslaved back to Africa. And I'll tell you the story of how that worked. Basically, a colony was set up, which was a British protectorate in West Africa, which became Sierra Leone. And the capital of Sierra Leone is called Freetown. It's called Freetown because British policy after 1808 was to take slave ships and bring them to Freetown and free all the people who had been enslaved. So Freetown becomes a really important and interesting place because they're basically freed slaves from all over Africa who are brought to Freetown to be freed. And there's a very interesting, unusual, unique community of Africans from all over Africa that emerges in Freetown, the so-called Creole community. Because of that, because basically more and more countries were outlawing slavery during the 1800s. Eventually, the U.S. did. The U.S. basically with the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, slavery becomes illegal in the U.S. Although it's only in 1865 it's really illegal at the end of the war. But at the same point in the early 1800s, the U.S. Constitution barred the slave trade. There was supposed to be no more slave trading in the U.S. And there still was a lot of slave trading in the U.S., but it was all smuggling. It was all illegal. So there were slaves that were being captured and brought to the U.S. right up until the eve of the Civil War. But that data wasn't recorded in tax registers anymore. It wasn't recorded in customs houses anymore. Basically, until slavery became illegal, this was like all trade. It was just recorded. So there's good data in the 1700s. In the 1800s, the data is worse. So those numbers are probably underestimates. Really, in the 1700s and the 1800s, there was just tons of slave trading going on. Yeah.
Is there any estimate of how low that figure actually is, or is it too abstract?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure if the historians can venture better guesses than this. Nathan Nunn, I'll talk about his data in a second, really relies on a lot of these official registers, so he's going to focus on that. But yeah, I'm not sure by how much it changed. Yeah. Sorry, say that again? Well, there was actually, so the Red Sea and trans-Saharan trades were taking place even before the Atlantic slave trade, for hundreds of years earlier. And there had been slavery in many parts of the world. I'm not saying that slavery was somehow invented in 1450. Of course, there was slavery in the ancient world, there was slavery in China, there was slavery in many places. So the trans-Saharan and Red Sea trades had been going on for a long time. There were North African kings who were basically staffing their army with African slaves, and that had been going on for a long time as well. Your question where it came from gets a little bit to Radhika's question, which I promise we're going to come to in a few slides about why Africa was victimized in this way. So maybe we'll hold off a little bit, but that's a critical question. It's a critical question just because of our intellectual curiosity. It's also a critical question for understanding the effects of the slave trade, meaning if certain types of societies were targeted in particular, that may complicate our estimation of the effects of the slave trade, because there could be some omitted variable. It could be that certain types of societies were targeted, and they would have had a different development trajectory even without the slave trade. So we're going to have to understand the causes a little bit more. Yeah, so what ends up happening, a lot of this is really driven by the rise of plantation agriculture in the New World, in the Americas. So as settlement in Brazil takes off, Brazil actually was the country that received the most African slaves. As plantation agriculture in the Caribbean became more developed, again, there was more demand for African slavery. So you really can't separate out what's going on. In the first week of the course, we said, how does development in China affect Africa? And that was one set of issues, nothing like this in some way, but this is saying, hey, development in the Americas and sort of the types of agriculture that were being developed in the Americas really it might have affected Africa, because it affected this demand for captive labor. Working on a sugar plantation in the Caribbean or Brazil was terrible work. There was so much disease at the time. Mortality rates were extremely high. and the European imperialists thought captive labor was the solution, basically forcing people to work. Yeah. This data doesn't. I'll show you a couple numbers on that later. So in parallel to all this, there was an internal African slave trade. And there was a lot of what's called domestic slavery, meaning internal African slavery, that was going on as well. It's a little harder to get data on until the 1800s, but starting in the 1800s, there's more kind of reliable historical data on the extent of domestic slavery. And in many African societies, there was a ton of domestic slavery, especially near big slave ports. So basically, once this infrastructure had been set up to capture African slaves to sell to Europeans, then there developed more and more sort of internal domestic African slavery. At least that's one interpretation of what's going on. So for instance, in Zanzibar, a huge share of the population were slaves. Okay, so I mentioned Freetown, Sierra Leone, which was this interesting, important place. It's also the site of some of the best data that exists on how people got captured, just sort of how this worked. How we talked about slave raiding. Initially the Portuguese went and got people directly and captured them. Over time it changed, and there developed sort of slave trading. You could think of them as organized crime groups, basically. Slave trading gangs, slave trading groups, whose business was slave trading. They were slave traders. And there were different ways that they acquired slaves to sell. And our best window into that is a census that was undertaken in Freetown in the 1840s. So this is about 50 years after Freetown was set up. They did a census, and they asked people who had been slaves, sort of, how were you captured? Like, how did you become a slave? How did this happen? These are folks who had been captured, taken on ships, and brought, and basically as their ship was traveling across the Atlantic, they were intercepted by the British Navy and brought to Freetown. So they typically remembered just what happened to them. And roughly a third of people were captured in different ways. About a third of people were slaves taken in war, meaning there was warfare between two groups, and the losing side was enslaved and sold into slavery. So if we fought a war, you lost. All the captives, instead of killing the captives or bringing them to my area or freeing them or whatnot, we would capture you and sell you to slave traders. That was your sort of punishment for losing the war, being my opponents. About a third of people were soldiers captured in war, then sold into slavery. About a third were kidnapped. And most of those who were kidnapped were children, literally like kidnapping of kids. So these were often very young kids, 6-year-olds, 8-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 12-year-olds, who were playing at home, who were walking around on their farm, and who were just abducted. People just came, stuffed them in a sack, and just dragged them to a slave market to be sold. About a third of people were captured in that way. So parents could be out in the fields and hear their kid screaming, or their kid is, disappears, and that's what happened to them. That was about a third of the people. That was a very common thing to do. And you can imagine, kids are smaller. They don't, if there's a 10-year-old, they can't fight you as well. And they're just going to be easier to transport and feed and everything along the way, but they'll grow into grown-ups if they live that long. So they were still valuable on these terrible, brutal slave markets. A third of people were enslaved after either committing a crime. They're basically enslaved. A third of people were enslaved by their own community. After committing a crime, if they were a criminal, their punishment could be being sold into slavery. They might be sold by relatives. If a relative incurred a debt that they couldn't pay, one way they could eliminate that debt was by selling a child or selling a relative into slavery. That was pretty common. Some people who were sold into slavery had been accused of witchcraft, just to tie into a paper we talked about before, and their punishment for being convicted of witchcraft, being a witch, was being sold into slavery. So there were many different stories of what happened that sort of led people to be sold, and large numbers in each of these categories. Radhika. That's a very good question. There's a new paper. It's a working paper. It's not published. It just came out by a guy who presented here at Berkeley a couple weeks ago. He presented a different paper. His name is James Fenske, and he's a professor of economic history at Oxford. And he's really one of the experts, the world's experts on African economic history. So he has a paper on exactly this. He finds that when there were adverse climate conditions, there were more slaves being sold into slavery on the Atlantic trade. So in other words, local calamities, local conflict, local disruption fed into the slave trade. So it's a great hypothesis, and it's just starting to be answered now, but it really does speak to this issue. What he does, he says, well, those areas that were hit by those climate anomalies had more slave trading activity, and that in itself could have all these consequences that Nathan Nunn talked about. So there's sort of a double negative effect of the climate shock in that case. No, there's lots of females also sold into slavery, males and females who were captured in all the slave trades. There were somewhat different proportions. Some of the historians have said, for instance, in some of the sources that in the Middle Eastern trade, the sort of trans-Saharan and Red Sea trades, there were slightly higher proportions of females, but there were males and females in both trades, in all the different slave trades. Okay, so that's a little bit of how people were captured. How did it happen? Well, slave trading was, again, carried out by Africans who captured people and sold them in these major slave trading ports that developed all over sub-Saharan Africa, from West Africa, if we think Senegal, Benin, Sierra Leone, Nigeria, down the coast into Angola, across to Mozambique, and as I said, in East Africa, there was Zanzibar, and others. There were many slave trading ports. The biggest ports in sub-Saharan Africa were these big slave trading ports, where there were slave markets, et cetera. And what's kind of interesting about it is sort of how the trade progressed. Europeans traded a lot of things for these people who were brutally enslaved. They traded horses, they traded metal goods and manufactured goods from Europe, they traded textiles. This was the beginning of sort of mass textile production in Europe with the Industrial Revolution, et cetera. But the most common thing that was sold were guns. So basically the kind of classic transaction was slaves for guns. And if you're a slave trader, this makes perfect sense. What gives you the power to keep your business going? Just violent force, guns. So what ends up happening is you have these slave gangs or slave criminal units, basically, being armed by Europeans to carry out more slave trading. And that was a very typical transaction. So it's estimated there were tens of millions of guns traded for slaves during this period, in addition to all the other things that were traded. And what's